Welcome in, everybody. I am Jasmine, or Tie-Dye Peacock, and today I will be reading Anatomy of the Spirit, The 7 Stages of Power and Healing by Caroline Myss. Today I'm going to start with the introduction, a brief personal history. As I say to people attending my workshops and my lectures, I am taking you into the world that exists behind my eyes. But if I first tell you about the series of wake-up calls that led to my own perspective, if I first introduce you to the many different people and events that over the years directed me toward becoming a medical intuitive, you may become more aware of the inner guidance at work in your own life. Turning points. Everything that has professional, personal, and spiritual value for me, I have learned through my work as a medical intuitive. As a college student, however, I was headed in a very different direction. Overloaded with ambition, I studied journalism, and in my junior year, I decided that I would win the Pulitzer Prize before I turned 30. The problem with this plan, I discovered while working at my first newspaper job, was that I lacked the talent required for successful newspaper reporting. I quit the paper, but I could not accept that my only dream career, being a writer, would not come true. Having no backup dream, I descended into a poisonous, gluey depression, a classic dark night of the soul. During the worst months, I could sleep late into the morning, then sit on the floor of my home office staring at half-written magazine articles. One morning, just as I was coming out of a deep sleep, still in that state between wakefulness and sleep, I was overwhelmed with a sensation that I had died and I was only remembering this lifetime. I felt grateful that my life was over. When I finally opened my eyes and realized I was still very much alive, nausea overtook me and I spent the morning vomiting my disappointment. Exhausted, I returned to bed to try to evaluate where I had miscalculated in planning my life. At that point, a memory of a homework assignment in a journalism class exploded into my mind. My journalism professor had spent a fair amount of time emphasizing the importance of objectivity in accurate newspaper reporting. Objectivity, she said, meant keeping yourself emotionally detached from the subject on which you were reporting and seeking out only the facts that describe a situation. She asked us to imagine that a building was on fire and that 4 reporters, each standing on a different corner, were covering the story. Each reporter would have a different view of the same event. Each would interview the people on his or her corner. The question the teacher posed to us was, which reporter had the real facts and the accurate point of view? That is, which reporter saw the truth? Suddenly, that simple assignment from years ago took on immense symbolic meaning for me. Perhaps truth and reality were actually only matters of perception. I thought, perhaps I had been looking at life with only one eye, seeing the building from only one corner, and sharing it with others who also lacked depth perception. I realized that I had to open my other eye, and get out of that corner. My exhausted, frustrated mind then made another leap backward. The year after I graduated from college, I left my hometown, Chicago, to go to work for a summer in Alaska. I traveled across country with good friends to Seattle, where we boarded a ferry and headed up the Inland Passage for a 3-day trip to Haines, None of us slept the whole time, so that by the time we arrived in Haines, we were practically seeing double. We were met at the dock by a man who drove us in a van from the ferry to the local hotel. We went to our room and collapsed on the beds, everyone but me fallen into a deep sleep. I was too wound up, so I left the hotel and started wandering around the town. The van driver spotted me, stopped his vehicle, and asked me where I was going. I told him I was out for a walk. He told me to jump in his van, which I did, and he dropped me off in front of an old 2-story wooden building. Go up on the second floor, he said. The name of the woman who lives there is Rachel. Go talk to her for a while, and I'll come back and get you. Today, back in Chicago, such behavior would be considered fairly dangerous. But at the time, my reasoning ability was eclipsed by my exhaustion and by my fascination with Alaska. So I did just what he suggested. I walked up the stairs and knocked on the door. A Native American woman in her early 80s, Rachel, opened the door and said, "Well, come on in. I'll make you some tea." This was Alaskan etiquette, gracious, trusting, warm hospitality. She did not seem surprised to see me, nor did she act as if I were an imposition. For her, this was just an ordinary experience for someone dropping in for tea and conversation. As I sat dreamily in Rachel's home, I felt as if I were between two different worlds. Half the apartment was decorated with objects from Russian culture, icons of the Black Madonna, a samovar in which Rachel was making the tea, Russian lace window curtains. The other half was pure Athabascan Indian, including a small totem pole and an Indian blanket that hung on the wall. Looking up from the samovar, Rachel noticed that I was looking at the totem pole. "Do you know how to read a totem pole?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I didn't realize you could read one." "Oh my, yes. Totem poles are spiritual statements about the guardians of the tribe," Rachel said. "Look at that one. The animal on the top is the bear. That means that the spirit of the bear is strong, clever, that's stalking its prey, but never killing just to kill, only for protection, and needing long periods of sleep to recover his strength. This spirit guides our tribe. We must imitate that spirit." Hearing those words, I woke up. I was in the presence of a good teacher, and a good teacher brings me to attention instantly. Rachel told me that she was half Russian and half Athabascan and had lived in Alaska long before it became a state. As she shared, albeit briefly, her background and Athabascan spiritual traditions with me, she changed my life forever. See that blanket on the wall? That blanket is very special. In the Athabascan culture, being a blanket maker or a songwriter or having any occupation is a matter of great honor. You have to have permission from a songwriter to sing his songs because his songs contain his spirit. And when you are a blanket maker, you are forbidden to begin weaving a blanket unless you know you will live long enough to finish it. If you find out that you need to die, mind you, she said, need to, you must perform a ceremony with someone who will agree to finish the task for you, because you cannot leave one part of your work unfinished before you die. Otherwise, you leave a part of your spirit behind. That blanket was almost finished when the Great Spirit came in a dream to the woman who was making it and told her to prepare to leave the earth. She asked the spirit if she could live long enough to finish the blanket, and the spirit said yes. She would be given that much more time. She died 2 days after finishing that blanket. Her spirit is in that blanket, and in a good and powerful way, and it gives me strength. Life is simple, Rachel said. You are born into a life to care for each other and for the earth. And then you receive word that your time has come to an end, and you must make the proper arrangements to depart, leaving behind no unfinished business. You must make your apologies, pass on your tribal responsibilities, and accept from the tribe It's gratitude and love for your time with them. Simple as that. Rachel paused to pour our tea and began again. Tomorrow night I go to a ceremony, a potlatch ceremony. A man is preparing to leave the earth, and he will give to the tribe all his belongings. He will lay his clothes and his tools in a long dish. The tribe will symbolically accept his belongings, meaning that he will be released from any tribal responsibilities so that he can complete the work of his spirit. Then he will leave us, said Rachel. I was dumbstruck by Rachel's serenity and matter-of-fact attitude, especially her calmness about death. Where was all the fear about death to which I was accustomed in my own culture? Rachel had just blown up my entire world as I understood it, in particular, my concept of the spiritual dimensional life, or God, yet she was as casual as the summer rain. I wanted to dismiss the truth she offered over tea as nothing more than primitive beliefs, but my gut feeling told me she knew a God that was far more real than my own. How does this man know he is going to die? Is he sick? I asked. Oh, she said, he went to the medicine man. The medicine man looked at his energy. His energy told the medicine man what was happening to him. And how does the medicine man know these things? She seemed shocked at my ignorance. Tell me, Rachel said, looking directly into my eyes. How is it that you do not know such things? How can you live without knowing what your spirit is doing and what your spirit is saying to you? She added, everyone goes to the medicine man to learn what his spirit is saying. Years ago, the medicine man said to me, you will have a broken leg soon if you do not walk better. I know he did not mean my physical walk. He meant that I was not honest because I wanted another woman's man. I needed not see that man anymore. It was hard for me because I loved this man, but my spirit was becoming sick from dishonesty. I left this place for a while, and when I returned, I walked straight. I desperately wanted to stay with Rachel for a while and learn more from her. I offered to clean her home, run errands, anything, but when the van driver came to collect me, she sent me away, and I never saw her again. As I climbed into the van, the driver said, she's something, isn't she? When I returned home from Alaska that fall, my body arrived without my spirit. It took me months to unite them again. Before meeting Rachel, I had not considered the power of our spirit as she had described it. I had never considered that we weave our spirits into everything we do and everyone we meet. Nor had I thought that my life choices expressed my spirit or affected my health. I see now that Rachel's story of emotional and physical healing is a good example of how using symbolic sight can change our lives. Although I did not know it at this time, my afternoon with her was my introduction to medical intuition. While I wasn't to begin my own work in this field for another 8 years, the memory of her drew me out of my post-newspaper depression and set me on a different course. I decided to study theology in graduate school, which I hoped would give me a greater perspective, akin to Rachel's, and help me finally break free of my street corner, my preconceptions and mental limitations. Perhaps the God I thought I knew was not the God that actually existed. Since he was certainly not answering my prayer to be a writer, perhaps the God I did not yet know would prove more responsive. I arrived in graduate school in a state of crisis, feeling powerless for the first time in my life. Still, I completed a master's degree in the study of mysticism and schizophrenia, the madness encountered on the path towards spiritual sanity. Later, I would come to see that my very feeling of powerlessness had led me to study power for the lives of mystics, our lessons in physical, emotional, and spiritual reverence and disempowerment, followed by rebirth into a new relationship to power. Behind closed doors, through anguish and ecstasy, mystics gain access to the spirit. Access so profound they become capable of breathing in energy. like divine electricity, into ordinary words and acts. They become able to heal others through acts of genuine love, forgiveness, and faith. Some of the best known mystics of the Christian culture, Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Clare of Assisi, Julian of Nordwick, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Catherine of Siena, and the more contemporary Padre Pio, are said to be in a conscious, intimate dialogue with God, living in clarity well beyond ordinary consciousness. The world behind their eyes is infinitely more real to them than the world before their eyes. Mystics' perceptions about reality and the power are different from those of ordinary people. In the language of Christianity, mystics are in the world, but not of the world. In the language of Buddhism and Hinduism, they are detached from the illusions of the physical world. They can see symbolically, clearly, because they are awake. The word Buddha means one who is awake. Although the spiritual path to attain this degree of consciousness and clarity can be arduous, no matter how much physical misery these mystics encountered along the way, none of them ever asked to return to ordinary consciousness. In my own use of intuition and symbolic sight, I help people see why they have become ill. I often ponder the lives of mystics, especially the theme of the individual's relationship to power. When I was still new to intuition, I had not yet made the connection between disease, healing, and personal power, but I now believed that power is the foundation of health. My own objectivity, my symbolic perspective on life, helps me to evaluate people's relationships to power and how power influences their bodies and spirits. These days, I use Rachel's language to tell people that they have woven their spirits into negative things, and that to recover their health, they need to retreat for a while, pull their spirits back, and learn to walk straight again. Would that we could follow such simple instructions, because our spirits do contain our lives and our life choices. We do indeed weave our spirits into the events and relationships of our lives. Life is as simple as that. An intuitive apprenticeship. As I look back at the last 14 years, I see now that a schedule had been arranged for my education, one directed toward teaching me to interpret the language of energy for intuitive diagnosis. From 1983 to 1989, when I was an apprentice intuitive, extraordinary synchronicities helped teach me what I needed to know. First, I noticed that I was meeting clusters of people who were all coping with the same disorder. In 1 week, 3 people would contact me with the same type of cancer. A few weeks later, I would have calls from 3 other people, all of whom suffered from migraine headaches. Eventually, I met clusters of people with diabetes, breast cancer, colon problems, prostate cancer, mitral valve prolapse, depression, and numerous other health problems. Before my decision to accept my intuitions, the people who contacted me had not shown up in any particular pattern. Simultaneously, quality of information I was receiving increased. It showed me how the emotional, psychological, and physical stress of the subjects' lives had contributed to the development of their illness. At first, I simply noted the impression I received of each person, not thinking to compare one person's stress patterns with another's. Eventually, though, I began to see that no illness develops randomly, and I reviewed my previous cases to look for emotional and psychological patterns that preceded the particular illness. By 1988, I was able to identify the emotional, psychological, and physical stress patterns of nearly 100 different illnesses. These patterns have since proven valid and useful to many physicians and other health professionals whom I have taught. Meeting Norm Shealy was another extraordinary event. Besides being a neurosurgeon, Norm is the founder of the American Holistic Medical Association and the leading American expert on the management of pain. Since 1972, he has been interested in metaphysical subjects. In the spirit of 1980, in the spring of 1984, I was invited to attend a fairly exclusive Midwestern conference, not because of my intuitive abilities, but as a publisher at Still Point, which was still my main occupation. During the conference, I met a psychologist who pointed out Norm Shealy to me. For no apparent reason, he said, "See that man over there? He's a physician who has an interest in medical intuitives." I became increasingly nervous, but I decided to approach Dr. Seeley and tell him that I was a medical intuitive. Over lunch one day, when I was seated next to him, I told him that I was able to diagnose people at a distance. He didn't seem the least bit impressed. Rather, he peeled an apple and asked me, "How good are you?" Told him that I wasn't sure. Then he asked, "Can you identify a brain tumor in someone? Can you see a disease forming in a person's body?" I don't need anyone to tell me that someone's energy is low. I can see that for myself. I need someone who can scan a person like an x-ray machine. I told Dr. Shealy that I was uncertain of my accuracy since I was relatively new at this. He said he would give me a call sometime when he had a patient he thought might benefit from my skill. The next month, May 1984, he phoned me at Still Point. He had a patient in his office. He told me, then gave me the patient's name and age and waited for my response. I recall the evaluation I gave vividly because I was so nervous. I spoke of my impressions in images rather than in psychological terms. I told Dr. Shealy that I felt as if his patient had concrete running down his throat. I then commented on the emotional issues that, from my point of view, preceded the development of the physical condition. The patient, an addict, was so terrified to admit his condition that he was physically unable to speak the truth about it. The words froze in his throat. When I was finished, Dr. Shealy said thanks and hung up. I had no idea whether I had done an adequate job, but later he told me that the man had cancer of the esophagus. That was the beginning of my work with Norm Shealy. His non-emotional response to my evaluation turned out to be an enormous blessing. Had he carried on about my skill in those days, I would have become self-conscious and probably would have tried to impress him, which no doubt would have interfered with my accuracy, as it was his detachment kept me objective and clear. So as I learned from my journalism teacher, and as I now teach others, detachment is essential to accomplishing an accurate evaluation. Nothing causes more interference than the need to be right, or to prove that you can do an intuitive evaluation. Over the next year, Norm helped me study human anatomy, and he called me several more times for evaluations on his patients. With each patient, my evaluations became more and more technically accurate. Instead of receiving vague images of body organs, I could soon recognize and distinguish the exact vibrations of specific disease and its location in the person's physiology. Each illness and each body organ, I learned, has its own frequency or vibrational pattern. It never occurred to me back then that Norm and I would one day become a working team. While I had already committed myself to understanding my skill, I was still investing most of my energy in Still Point success. Then in March 1985, I encountered a young man whose courage in confronting and healing his illness gave me the courage to open myself to my intuitions in a new way. While working with Norm, I had become more confident in my ability to identify by name the illnesses that I sensed, as well as their energy stresses and precessors. I avoided directing clients into a specific course of healing, however, leaving that to Norm. What little I knew about healing was limited to the manuscripts I read and to the conversations with my associates. On a Saturday morning in March 1985, I received a telephone call from a man named Joe, whom I had met casually after a lecture I gave in Kansas City. He told me that he had a feeling that something was wrong with his son, Peter. He asked if I would do an evaluation. Because Peter was already an adult, I asked Joe to contact him and get his permission for me to evaluate him. Within 10 minutes, the father called me back to say that Peter was open to any help I could give him. I asked for Peter's age, and then when he told me, I instantly was overwhelmed with the feeling that he had leukemia. I had not mentioned this to Joe, but I asked for Peter's phone number, saying I would like to speak directly to him. As I made notes on the intuitive impressions I was receiving, I realized that the vibration I was sensing was not the one for leukemia, after all, but I couldn't identify the frequency, since I hadn't encountered it before. Then I suddenly realized that Peter was HIV positive. A conversation with him remains vivid in my memory because I knew I would feel strange if some strange woman across the country telephoned me and said, "Hey, I've just checked out your energy system, and not only are you HIV positive, but you've already begun to develop AIDS." Peter's body was in fact beginning to manifest the symptoms of PCP, the most common lung disorder associated with the HIV virus. What I actually said to Peter that morning was, "Peter, I'm a friend of your father's. I'm a medical intuitive." And I tried to explain what I did. Finally, I said, "Peter, I've evaluated your energy, and you have AIDS." His reply was, "Jesus, Caroline, I'm so scared. I've had 2 tests, and they've both come out HIV positive." The sound of his voice, his instant trust, caused a rush of emotion to flow through me. And we talked about what he should do next. Peter told me that his father did not even know he was a homosexual, much less that he had AIDS. I said I would not tell his father anything, but I encouraged him to be honest about his life and health. We spoke for about an hour and a half. As soon as I hung up, his father called and asked about my conclusions. I told Joe that Peter needed to speak with him and that I did not feel it was appropriate for me to share the contents of Peter's and my conversation. He said, "I know what's wrong with my son. He wants to drop out of law school, and he's afraid to tell me." I did not reply, and we concluded our conversation. 20 minutes later, Joe phoned me back. "I've been thinking about the worst possible thing that could be wrong with my son," he said. "And if my son called me and said, 'Dad, I have AIDS,' I realized that I would still love him." I responded, "I hope you mean that, because that is exactly what you're going to hear." Another 30 minutes passed, and Joe called again to tell me Peter was on his way home, and that by noon the next day, they would both be in my living room in New Hampshire. I was stunned and immediately called Norm. Norm and I created a healing program for Peter, which included adopting a healthy, near-vegetarian diet, doing aerobic exercise, quitting smoking, using castor oil packs across his abdomen for 45 minutes a day, and psychotherapy to help him liberate himself from his cessery about being gay. Peter did what he needed to do to heal, without complaining or feeling that healing was an effort. In fact, he had an "is that all" attitude. Many people might note here enter their healing programs as if they were being punished. Norm and I have since worked with countless individuals, including a woman who suffered from obesity, diabetes, and chronic pain. We spoke with her about how she could improve her condition immediately by changing to a healthy nutritional program and exercising moderately. Her response was, "Absolutely not. I could never do those things. I don't have any willpower. What other suggestions do you have for me?" Peter, in contrast, accepted his personal responsibility for healing with gratitude and treated all the demands of his healing program as effortless. 6 weeks later, his blood test was HIV negative. Peter is now a practicing attorney, and he remains HIV negative to this day. Afterward, Norm and I wrote up this case study in our first book, AIDS Passageway to Transformation, Still Point, 1987. As a consequence for working with Peter, Norm and I began to hold workshops for people who were either HIV positive or had developed AIDS, believing deeply that if one person could heal himself, others could as well. From hobby to profession, Peter's dramatic healing from an illness considered terminal brought me the first of several invitations I got to lecture abroad on the subject of AIDS and on healing in general. His case was a turning point for me and led me to begin to contemplate the origins of illness, specifically how and why an illness develops, what it takes to heal an illness, and why some people heal and others don't. I particularly began to wonder what might predispose an entire culture to be susceptible to an epidemic. What emotional and physical stress triggers a group chemistry to lead to illness? Thinking symbolically, I could almost see the manifestations of AIDS as a global illness. The lung disease, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, may be a symbolic of the destruction of the rainforests, from which the earth draws the greatest proportion of its oxygen supply. Primarily, Kaposi's sarcoma, the cancerous skin lesions that form in many AIDS patients, is symbolic of the destruction of the earth's natural surface, perhaps most dramatically by the testing of nuclear weapons, but also by toxic wastes and other forms of pollution. And finally, the human immune system can symbolize the Earth's ozone layer, which is now as fragile as the immune system in the very ill patient. Some people referred to Peter's case as a miracle, implying that he had received a special grace from God that assisted his healing, and that without that grace he would never have gotten well. While that might be the case, one must still ask, what does it take to make a miracle happen? I believe that our cell tissues hold the vibrational patterns of our attitudes, our belief systems, and the presence or absence of an exquisite energy frequency, or grace, that we can activate by calling back our spirits from negative attachments. As A Course in Miracles says, miracles are natural. Something is wrong when they don't happen. Peter's healing induced me to discover what we do that interferes with the energy that makes miracles happen. For instance, you can be a vegetarian and run 6 miles a day, but if you are in an abusive relationship, or hate your job, or have daily fights with your parents, you are losing energy or power in a pattern of behavior that can lead to illness or prevent your healing from an illness. On the other hand, if you are spiritually centered and call back your energy from negative beliefs, you can eat cat food and still stay healthy. Please understand that I am not advocating that you eat an unhealthy diet and avoid exercise. It's just that these factors alone will not keep you healthy. Nor am I saying that a commitment towards becoming spiritually conscious guarantees your health. It will, however, enhance your life and self-understanding and set the stage for maximizing healing, be it spontaneous or gradual, physical and spiritual. The more I have come to understand the relationship between our interior dynamics and the quality of our health and our lives in general, the more I have felt committed to my work as an intuitive. Norm and I have continued our research together, and in 1988 published our findings on the emotional and psychological issues that precede the development of illness in The Creation of Health, Still Point, 1988. The final turn in the road. Shortly after completing that book, I suffered an accident in which I nearly bled to death. The trauma turned a nosebleed into a massive hemorrhage. In the ambulance, on my way to the hospital, I was sitting on a stretcher, bleeding into an enormous bowl on my lap, since I would have choked if I had laid back, when suddenly my head fell forward and I was instantly on the outside of the ambulance, floating down the highway while observing through the ambulance window my body and the frantic activity of the rescue workers to save me. Suddenly, I was euphoric, completely light, and vibrationally alive in a way I had never been before. It occurred to me that I was out of my body, perhaps even dead. I awaited the tunnel I had heard so much about, but none appeared. Instead, I felt myself drifting away from the earth. I entered into a state of calm so intense that remembering it, even now, has a powerful effect on me. Then I saw an image of Norm. He was standing on a stage, preparing to give a lecture, holding up a copy of The Creation of Health. I heard him say, I thought it was going to be the beginning of our work together, but it has sadly turned out to be the end. I got an urgent desire to return to my body, to regain physical life, and immediately I felt myself racing toward and into my body. After this experience, I asked myself only one question. Why didn't I see my publishing company from that state? I knew then that I would leave the company and pursue medical intuition for the rest of my life. As a professional medical intuitive, I have worked with as many as 15 physicians around the country, including Christine Northrup, MD, an OBGYN who is one of the founders of a women's health clinic called Women to Women in Yarmouth, Maine, and author of Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom, Anthem, 1994. Chris phoned me for a personal health evaluation in autumn of 1990, and after our session, she called me for intuitive evaluations of many of her patients. The opportunity to work with Chris and other physicians signaled my own coming of age as a medical intuitive. It showed me that my work with the human energy system could be used to help physicians help others. From 1990 through 1992, in addition to expanding my practice with physicians, I conducted an overwhelming number of workshops, both alone and with Norm, in the United States, Australia, Europe, Mexico, and Canada. In those early workshops, I would lecture on the human energy system, then perform an intuitive health evaluation on every one of the workshop participants. Sometimes this meant that I did as many as 120 health evaluations over the course of one weekend. Often, I would end a workshop bathed in sweat. At the end of a working day, I was exhausted. After 2 years of this work, I was burning out. As has always happened for me, just when I came to the end of my strength, a new door opened. In February 1992, I was teaching a workshop in upstate New Hampshire. The group had just returned from lunch, and I began the afternoon session by sitting down next to a woman and asking her, "What can I do for you today?" I assumed she would mention a health problem, as other participants had, and then I would be off and running, so to speak. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, looked at me as if I were a con artist, and said, "I don't know, you tell me. I paid my money." To say I filled up with rage is like saying it gets a bit cool in Montana in winter. I wanted so much to pick up this woman and escort her to the door that I actually began to hyperventilate. I took a deep breath and said, I'm going to sit here next to you until I can think of a reason to thank you for that comment. And we might be here for a very long time." The atmosphere in the workshop grew tense. No one moved. And then it hit me. I jumped out of my seat and announced, "I will no longer be doing personal health evaluations on anyone. Instead, I will teach you to evaluate yourselves. There is only one of me, and if I keep this up, I'm not going to live very long. If any of you want your money back, ask for it now. Otherwise, take out your notebooks because we're going to work, and you're going to learn to see your bodies as I see them. I'll help you a great deal more if I can teach you to locate a problem in your own body without needing me to do it for you. I looked at this now shaken woman and said, I think you just might have saved my life. I am grateful to you. No one asked for a refund, and that day I began to teach others self-diagnosis. By the autumn of 1992, Norm and I were discussing developing a training program in the science of intuition. We met with an entrepreneur from Netherlands who agreed to finance the first stages of our training program, and in 1993 we began our intensive workshops on teaching medical intuition, which led eventually to my writing this book. Teaching this system in workshops has given me the privilege of hearing the life stories of many participants, some of whose case stories I describe in this book. Among them are patients who helped themselves in energy terms, avoiding the development of an actual physical illness, and in physical terms, reversing or healing an illness that had already appeared. In organizing this book, I have followed the sequence that has worked successfully for me in teaching the technical aspects of medical intuition, intuitive healing evaluations. Chapter 1, in Part 1, introduces the principles of medical intuition as I have come to know them and offers instructions on how to apply them yourself. Chapter 2, in Part 1, introduces a complementary and I believe new model of the human energy system based upon the synthesis of three spiritual traditions: the Hindu teachings regarding the chakras, the symbolic meaning of the 7 Christian sacraments, and the mystical interpretation of the 10 Sephirot, or the Tree of Life, presented in the Zohar, which is the major text of the Kabbalah, the mystical teachings of Judaism. The 7 chakras, the 7 Christian sacraments, and the Tree of Life symbolize the 7 levels of the human energy system and the 7 stages of human development, or the 7 essential lessons of the universal spiritual path, or the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell would have described it. Chapter 2 is in many ways the heart of the book because it presents a spiritual biological profile of the human energy system. Chapter 2 concludes with an extensive interpretation of the spiritual and energy perceptions that I now use to guide me in my work. These perceptions will provide the foundation for your learning the language of energy and symbolic sight. They may help you gain insights into the energy patterns of your own and your loved ones' physical and spiritual health. In Part 2, chapters 1 through 7, I give the anatomy of the 7 power centers of the human body, with basic information and real-life case studies that illustrate how we use energy data in our spiritual development. The afterword, a guide for contemporary mystic, suggests how we can apply symbolic sight to our personal development and health. As I tell my students at the beginning of each workshop, take with you only what feels accurate and truthful to your own heart.